All right, so let's go over these then. Okay, structure number 1. What are we looking at here? It's a water vacuole. All right, what is the function of the water vacuole? Right. Yeah, uses water to support the cell. If they wrote uses the Turgor pressure of water to support the cell, that would be wonderful. Okay, but I would suggest anything like keep cell, shape, support cell, anything like that would be acceptable. 1 mark for cell, for water vacuole, 1 mark for supporting the cell. Okay, so 1 mark for the name, 1 mark for the function. All right, number 3. This is the kind of bluish green stuff with the dots on it. Rough ER. Okay, so rough ER. What does the rough ER do? Cassidy? Transports protein. So if they have rough ER and transports protein, that's 2 marks. Haley, question? It doesn't create the protein. That's what the ribosomes do. All right. Number 5. Dot inside of the big ball in the middle. Nucleolus. Okay, make sure they've got 2 L's here. Nucleolus. All right, what does the nucleolus do, Elizabeth? Right, it copies the DNA. Okay, I would also accept controls protein synthesis. Okay, makes RNA would also be acceptable. No, that's what the nucleus does, is it holds the genetic information. No. Yes, scans DNA into RNA, makes RNA. Yeah, that's copies DNA. That'd be fine. Produces. It doesn't produce DNA, no. All right. For number 8. What's number 8? Jordan, what's number 8? Anybody know? Austin? Golgi apparatus. All right. Golgi apparatus does what, Tori? Right, gets rid of cells' waste material, makes vesicles to excrete waste. Anything about getting rid of waste will be fine. All right. What's number 9? The nucleus. Okay, nucleus's job, stores, holds DNA. Okay, holds cells' genetic material. Yeah, holds DNA, yeah. Okay, Tori? No, it is not that. All right, what's number 10? It is the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It burns sugars to release energy. It does not. No, it's got to have something about turning it into another form of energy. It has that, but that's not its function. Okay. Any others? It doesn't perform digestion, no. That's what I said. Yeah. All right. Number 11, space within the cell is more commonly or technically known as cytoplasm. Okay, function of the cytoplasm, okay, fluid to fill the cell, allows diffusion to occur. It's somewhat supportive if they have that, okay. There's kind of a lot of things you could write for cytoplasm, but mostly it has to do with it's a medium for diffusion to occur. Okay, without it, diffusion wouldn't work very well. Okay, the organelles would all sink to the bottom of the cell because it would be full of air. Okay, this way they kind of all float. All right, number 13. Yeah, I'll accept microfibers and filaments, but really those are clearly microtubules. Okay. Okay, they're clearly tubes. Okay, they're all tubes there. But anyway, if they have microfibers or filaments, I'll accept that. Their job, keep the shape of the cell. Okay, number 14. Chloroplasts. Okay, if their answer contains photosynthesis, they can have a mark. I don't care what else it says, unless destroys photosynthesis. Then that would, okay. But anything about photosynthesis that implies it's going on in there would be acceptable. Okay. And lastly, number 15. What's number 15 pointing at? It's pointing at the cell wall, the outside of the cell. Okay, and the cell wall's job is to, okay, right, structural support of the cell, keep cell shape, frame of the cell, something along those lines would be acceptable. If they have protects the cell or they have controls what gets in and out, that's not right, because the membrane does that. Okay, not the cell wall, so it's not protective at all. It is out of 20. Okay, give them a mark out of 20, and then go and put them on top of your cell anatomy labs in the box, please. Yep. So over the last few classes, we've been kind of focused on cellular transport. We've been talking about diffusion and osmosis, not as much about active transport, but certainly about the two passive processes, because they're the ones that are used most often. Okay, now, what we have to look at now is that in context of a multicellular organism. We're kind of done with looking at cells individually. Now we're looking at how do they cooperate and function together in a multicellular organism where there are specialized cells and kind of complex processes that might not go on within a single cell. So basically we're looking at transport in plants today, okay? And then tomorrow we will probably set up our lab to do a transport in plants and leave it run over the weekend. It tends to run best if we can give it 48 hours or more in which to run. All right, so what we have to look at today is how transport within cells is similar, okay, and still involved, okay, in transport in a multicellular organism. All right, so what we mean there is those same processes, diffusion, osmosis, and active transport, are being used on a large scale, okay, in a multicellular organism. All right, and by large scale, I don't mean we're using osmosis to transport water from your large intestine to your muscles. Okay, obviously that wouldn't work. Okay. Osmosis only works across a single cell membrane, okay, to balance concentrations. We would be talking about at a small level, it's causing major changes in the whole organism. Okay, we have to look at specifically here how water, sugar, and minerals are transported in vascular plants. Okay, now you may not have heard the term vascular before. Okay, vascular means a system of tubes. All right. We have a system of tubes, okay, our cardiovascular system, okay, that runs through our body, okay, and transports blood. Well, plants have a vascular system, at least vascular plants have that. They don't have a heart, obviously, pumping stuff, right, but they have series of tubes that transport water and nutrients up the plant and sugars that are produced in the leaves down the plant. So they have two different sets of tubes, and that's what we're going to be looking at, okay, here. The vascular plants would not include mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, which are types of plants that are non-vascular. They do not have tubes. They are usually plants that grow kind of in the undergrowth and can't get very tall, because without tubes to transport water, it gets difficult to be more than a few centimeters tall. You have to rely on diffusion to move stuff from one place to another. Okay. And then we got to look at the structure of vascular plants. So we'll talk about the different parts, the roots, the stem, the leaves, and how they all work. Okay, we'll look at that leaf diagram that we looked at again the other day. And then we'll look at what forces are involved in this transport. And some of that is going to be a review from what we talked about, water is a polar molecule, back in the chemistry unit. Okay, so I told you that was going to come back. Today's the day. Okay, questions on what we're going over? All right. Okay, the big challenge for plants is this. The resources they need are spatially separated. That means they're not in the same place. All right. The water and the nutrients and minerals and things that they need are underground, where it is unfortunately dark. Okay? Sunlight is Obviously not underground. So they've got to have parts of their body that are modified to do a certain job, or specialized. Okay, there's that key word again, specialized to do a certain job, and then have a way to exchange the materials between the parts, specialized parts of the plant that acquire them. Everybody with me so far? Okay, now there's a number of ways that plants have kind of developed or evolved to overcome this problem. Okay, the biggest way that all plants, all vascular plants share is they have a subterranean root system and a shoot system that includes their stem and leaves that is above ground. Okay, subterranean, in case you didn't know, means underground. Okay, terran refers to earth. Subterranean is under the earth. Okay, all right. So the resources they need, spatially separated. Soil provides water and minerals, but there's no light underground for photosynthesis. The body of the vascular plant has, like we said, the shoots and the roots. Now, some plants, like the strawberry, use this system in order to adapt to changing conditions in their environment, or overcome, not so much adapt. Okay, you have the original, let's say, parent plant, okay, growing in one spot. If that spot begins to become depleted of water or nutrients or both, then the strawberry will put out what's called a stolon. And you may have seen strawberry plants do this. It looks like a little crawler, okay, along the ground. Okay, just kind of moving. It just looks like a regular stem, but it's moving along the ground. It will, in fact, root to another location. And that stolon acts as a tube through which nutrients and water can be passed from this kind of offspring plant back to the original plant, and now the plant can survive in two locations, not very far apart, obviously, not more than about a meter, right? But it still allows, okay, for it to access nutrients and minerals that may not be accessible to the original root system. Everybody follow me on that one? Question? Oh, it can happen for sure. Yeah, I mean that's why you sometimes see a strawberry plant's all crunchy and dead, right? Yeah. Okay. Other plants that have something like that would be raspberries. Okay, if you've got some raspberry bushes in your yard, you know that they kind of come up everywhere, right? I used to, in my house in Lloydminster, I had a big raspberry patch, which was awesome because you could get all these great raspberries. But I was always cutting them off with the lawnmower because they'd come out in the middle of the lawn. Okay, like we're talking 20 or 30 feet from the other plants. Okay, they really have a lot of shoots and crawlers that can come up in different places. All right, another example of a way to adapt would be to develop an underground storage area, okay, where you can store things like starches and water and nutrients called a rhizome. Okay, some grassy types of plants will develop that. Okay, cassava is an example of a plant that does that. Okay, and they kind of grow the roots out of it, okay, but can store some of that in there. If the plant becomes stressed or the soil dries out, it can draw some of the minerals out of the rhizome. Okay, potatoes, okay, are also kind of rhizomes, but they will develop what's called a tuber, the potato, okay, on the end of the root. The potato stores what? Starch, which is energy. All right, this is what allows, let's say, this particular potato plant to regrow the following year. Right, it can use the energy from these tubers once the conditions improve, okay, to start growing new shoots, okay, above ground level and carrying out photosynthesis and starting all over again, okay, the next season. Okay, it's kind of how a perennial plant like that can grow and grow and grow. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's trying to get out into the sun, right? It's putting out a shoot system, trying to get out the door into the sun, okay, where it can start carrying out photosynthesis and essentially survive, right? Now, it obviously won't, even if it grows a really long one that gets into the sun, it still has no source of water. So once it's pulled all the moisture out of the tuber, it's going to die, right? Yes, ginger is like a rhizome, yeah. It's kind of a tuber and a rhizome, yeah. No, it can put out many. Yeah, if you have a mature strawberry plant, it'll put out a lot. Yeah. No, carrots are more of a tuber. Okay, they're kind of starchier. Yeah. All right, and then some plants will store, instead of as starch, they'll store their energy as kind of sugars, but at the base of their leaves. Okay, so the sort of the base of their leaves will swell, okay, and get kind of fleshy, and onions are an example of that, okay. Garlic is kind of an example of that as well, right, where just kind of the base of the plant is an energy storage area, and then they've got these small roots that grow out from the bottom. All right, and again, you could use this to seed the plant the next year. There's two ways to plant onions. You can use the tiny little seeds, or you can plant bulbs. Okay, bulbs is like this. A lot of flowers make bulbs, right? And you can plant the bulbs in your flower bed, and they'll grow from that, and that's essentially the same thing. Right? Okay, so those are some of the adaptations anyway. All right, other adaptations. Big thing about terrestrial plants is they're always exposed to the air, and the air is usually dry. All right, even on a really humid day, okay, water is still evaporating from the plants. All right, so they have to have a waxy cuticle, okay, that covers them and prevents water from evaporating from all the points, and it only evaporates out of the little holes called stomates. Somebody said it, yeah. Okay, so that is an important one to know. I always ask about that one. Okay, other things are that they've got to be able to support themselves. A terrestrial vascular plant has to compete for its resources. It's got to compete for water, compete for nutrients underground, and it's got to compete for sunlight above ground. Best way to compete for sunlight is to get very, very what? Tall. Okay? But if you're going to get very tall, you've got to be able to support a lot of weight. Okay? Not just your weight, but also the weight when it begins to sway. Right? Because wind comes up and starts blowing plants around, and if they're not very strong, they'll just tip over. Right? I mean, my palm plant over there is a prime example. It always has to be tied up on the sticks because it grows really tall but doesn't get any thicker to support itself and just falls over. Right? I don't know how it survives in the real world, but okay. Around here you have to tie it up. Now, most of the time the trees in our area, they grow, you know, pretty thick. It's not just their cell walls and their water vacuoles, though, that are supporting them. There's this special material in them called lignin. Lignin is essentially what makes a plant, okay, a woody type of plant. Okay, it's the material that's in lumber. Okay, that's in the trunk of a tree. All right, it solidifies and it cements the cell walls together. And then when those cells die, okay, you get this hard material. Okay, you get wood. All right, so you get lumber, you get that hard material that trees are made out of. Everybody with me there? Okay, not all plants have that. Okay, these plants, for example, over here, they don't make a lot of lignin. They're supported pretty much by the cell walls and the water vacuoles within them, which is why they fall over so easily. Whereas this one, okay, this dragon palm over here, it's quite a bit tougher. All right, palm trees, if you've ever seen like a real palm tree, okay, they're a marvel of nature's engineering. There's a ton of weight at the top of them, right? All those leaves and all those coconuts and everything like that up at the top, okay? And if you ever see them in a hurricane, they're just whipping back and forth. Like they'll go 10, 15 feet in either direction of center, okay? And they're just fine, right? They survive because they're not only very strong, but also quite flexible. Right? Our trees are even quite flexible. I mean, we don't kind of notice that when you take a 2x4 and make a wall out of it, right? But really, lumber, when you think about it, is quite bendy. Okay, it's strong, but it's got some ability to flex as well, which is important for a tree. If a tree was just rigid in a strong wind, it would snap. And you see that with older trees as they kind of get rotten in the middle. They're not so much as flexible and they just snap off. Okay, so lignin is really important if you're going to be like a giant sequoia, right, and grow to be hundreds of meters tall. Okay. Yes. Because usually they lose their leaves before that happens. Okay? If it does freeze while the leaves are on, it just kills the leaves. Right? It doesn't kill the rest of the tree. The tree would then hopefully be able to recover the next year. Right? But that does happen. If we get a really early freeze, right, then you see that trees will turn early, right? They'll lose a bunch of leaves or whatever. Most of the trees around here also have sugars and stuff inside of the water vacuoles that lower the freezing point. And so they don't typically freeze. That's why you see some types of trees hold their leaves a lot longer than others. Okay? They're not as susceptible. What causes a tree to actually lose its leaves? What's the signal? It actually isn't frost, because sometimes we get freeze in the middle of summer. If you were a tree, you wouldn't want to lose all your leaves in July. right, or August, because sometimes we do get freeze that early, is daylight. It's the number of hours of daylight. That's the most reliable signal for a plant to know that winter is coming. Right? So plants can detect essentially how much photosynthesis they're carrying out each day, and as that level decreases, okay, down to a certain number, whatever that number is, they don't actually keep track of the numbers, obviously, but okay, when they are only doing so much photosynthesis, they know winter's coming, and they shut everything down. They secrete a certain hormone that we'll talk about next week that causes the leaves to stop producing chlorophyll, and that's when they fall off. Okay, so yeah, they have to have that kind of adaptation, obviously, up here. In a tropical plant, you don't want that. You got to grow all the time. Well, pine trees are different. They're a conifer. They're an evergreen, so they don't have that signal. Their leaves are structured a lot different than needles, right? So they don't have as many water vacuoles. They rely mostly on the cuticle to hold them together. Larches, yes. Yeah. They're the only deciduous conifer. Yeah. Sort of, yeah. Okay. And it's because of where you typically see them. Okay? And they grow at certain altitudes in the mountains below where the evergreen ones are, usually. And so there's early frosts kind of in that area, so they'll lose them a little bit earlier. Okay, the other use for lignin, okay, is protection of seed-bearing parts. All right, if you're looking at like chestnuts, acorns, okay, and things like that, they're obviously covered with that hard shell that's like wood, okay, and that can be used to protect their seeds. Then those seeds don't get released for a very long time because it takes a long time for that hard shell to rot. Okay, and then when it finally does rot, probably the parent plant is already dead and it's not shading out its offspring. Okay, so it's kind of a timing thing. It also serves kind of a good survival purpose there. All right. Okay, so lignin, obviously going to be kind of an important term there. Okay, we talked about this the other day, and obviously I forgot to not water my plants, and so that none of them were wilty. So I had to get a picture of some wilty plants for you. So when a plant's water vacuoles are full, right? And most plants do have more than one water vacuole. We just typically label only one. Okay, they're full and they're pushing everything against, okay, the cell wall and the cell membrane. And you probably saw that when you looked at the plant cells in the cell anatomy lab. In a lot of those cells, it was very clear and everything was kind of against the edge, especially the chloroplasts, right against the edges of the cell, because everything's being pushed there. All right. Well, when that's the case, the plant can support itself. There's enough Turgor pressure there, okay, that it can support itself, just like a balloon. Right? When you blow up a balloon, if you only blow it up part way, it just kind of sags over. Right? But if you continue to put more and more air in it, it'll stand up. Okay. Now, as the water vacuoles begin to lose water, okay, and that happens in times of stress, if the plant's roots don't have access to water, okay, it'll start drawing it out of the water vacuoles, and then the plant will start to wilt. Right? When that situation becomes extreme, the cell membrane actually pulls away from the cell wall, and that causes the cell wall to be pulled in as well, and that makes the plant like completely kind of keel over. Now, can you still rescue that plant? Yes. All right. It's only when it gets brown and crunchy that it is beyond saving. All right. So you can get a plant pretty wilted, and it'll still come back as long as you provide it with water, okay, and nutrients and such. Okay, so you can see here in this bottom picture, though, that the water vacuoles have shrunk considerably, okay, from their sizes originally. All right, so Turgor pressure, that's the really important term, guys, okay? Pressure of water in the vacuole, so make sure you know that one, because that probably is something I would look for as, like, you know, the difference between a 4 out of 5 and a 5 out of 5 on an exam question explaining how a plant supports itself. Keenan. It's really sour. Just some plants put certain chemicals in, right? It makes it more acidic or whatever, okay, in order to discourage them being eaten, right? Like some plants want their fruit to be really sweet so that it gets eaten, because then animals will eat it, walk away, and deposit the seeds somewhere else in a very nutrient-rich fertilizing medium. Yeah, poop, right, okay. Honestly, guys, that's the purpose of fruit. The purpose of fruit is to allow seeds to be transported to other places and grow away from the competing adult parent plant. All right? Because if you're a little tiny sapling and you're trying to grow underneath all of these adult plants, what are you not getting? Well, nutrients or sunshine, right? You're shaded out. It's not a good situation. Most plants have strategies involving how they disperse their seeds. Spruce trees, pine trees, for example, a lot of them have their cones, but they're sealed in a resin, which is kind of like a wax. And the seeds don't come out until the wax melts. When do you suppose? Right, in a forest fire. So when a forest fire happens, it melts that resin and the seeds will pop out, which is great because now all the plants that would have been shading it out are dead. All right, and it's got a chance to compete now because the parent plants are gone. So again, it's another survival strategy. The thorns would more likely protect the leaves, right? And in that case, it's probably a plant where the seeds or the fruit fall to the ground, maybe roll a little ways away. It probably is a plant that doesn't have a really spread out root system. Right, and probably shorter, right? Most of the kind of shrubby type of plants that make small fruit, they can do that. Yeah, okay, but if you're talking about like an apple tree, something like that, it would like the fruit to go elsewhere. Okay. Well, I mean, it all has to do with the structure of the flower, okay? When the flower gets pollinated, okay, what's in pollen is plant sperm, okay? And the flower, at the base of the flower is the ovary. So I don't know if I've drawn this picture for you guys before. I drew it for one class. It looks kind of like a vase, okay? So in the middle of all flowers is something like this, and then you've got your petals kind of coming off, okay, kind of in all directions, right? Yeah. It's a terrible diagram, but okay, you get the idea, all right? And then usually off the side of the ovary are things called anthers, and they kind of grow out and above. Okay, this is where the pollen is. Right, you can see this really good on a tiger lily if you've ever seen one. Okay, and so the pollen's on here, and then this down here is the ovary. Right, so this is the ovary here. Inside of here are the eggs. So when pollen lands on the top of this thing, okay, it creates kind of a chemical reaction that makes a tube through which the sperm can swim, and they will fertilize the egg at the bottom of the ovary. Then the ovary swells and it develops into a fruit. And okay, the petals fall off, and that's why at the bottom of an apple, right, you see usually, well, it's actually kind of this is the part where the petals were. That's where you'll see kind of well, you know what it looks like in the bottom of an apple, right? And then this is the stem down here where it's attached to the tree and so on, right? So that's kind of where that all comes from. But when you eat a fruit, you're eating a mature ovary containing seeds. I hope that doesn't disgust anyone, but okay, yeah. Next time you're smelling a plant, think about what you're inhaling. Okay? You're inhaling pollen, which is plant sperm. So that means 6 of one, half a dozen of another. Either you're grossed out by the fruit or you're grossed out by the pollen. One or the other. Okay? All right. Everybody with me on that? Okay. So remember, Turgor pressure, very important. Lignin by itself is very good, but Turgor pressure is what supports the leaves. Okay? And if you're dealing with a fleshy plant, okay, the plant itself. All right. Parts of the plant. Obviously, we'll start at the bottom here. What's the job of the roots? To some extent, yeah, it's anchoring more than support, but to get nutrients, to get water, okay, that's the job of the roots, okay, so they got to acquire minerals, water, etc. from the nutrient medium that is soil. Now, there's a couple of different strategies for that. Plants can have one of two different types of root systems. They can have a taproot, like that, or they can have a fibrous root. Okay, so a carrot, a turnip, a beet, okay, Canada thistle, dandelions, things like that, all have tap roots, okay? They have one long central root that goes down really deep, and there's some branches, small branches that come off of it, okay? Those are examples of tap roots. The advantage of a taproot, it can go pretty deep. If the topsoil periodically dries out, you're better off to have a root that goes really deep where it can access soil that typically doesn't. dry out, all right? Because then you'd be able to survive short periods of drought. Okay? If typically that isn't a concern, then you would probably have more of a fibrous root system that is near the surface. Oddly enough, the Saguaro Cactus, like is on the Taco Time sign, okay, has a fibrous root system. Because in the desert, it doesn't matter how deep a taproot would go, it's still dry. Okay, there's never enough rain for it to soak in, okay, and get to the bottom. So you put your roots right at the surface, and then when it does rain, you grab up everything, okay, as quickly as you can and store it inside the plant. Everybody follow? Okay. A saguaro cactus can have a root system that can be spread out 50 to 80 meters from the plant, but right at the surface. All right. Okay, so they're very well anchored, and they have a good surface area around them to gather water with. Right? Typically around our area, our bigger plants have fibrous roots, but they don't spread out that far. Okay? They're kind of very dense right around the base of the plant, and that kind of holds them in place. And usually we don't have really long periods of drought, so we don't have to worry about it too much. Bryce? Yeah, the ones that come out of the soil are actually old, very old roots, and so they've swollen to be more of a transport tube as opposed to a nutrient acquiring tube. The nutrient ones are usually the really small ones because they have a good surface area to volume ratio that allows them to absorb quickly, whereas that big thick root has a big volume, small surface area by comparison. It's mostly just a tube, okay, through which stuff travels. But that's a good question. Okay. Well, because a lot of roots are energy storage, right? A taproot typically has a double purpose, not just to acquire nutrients, but also to store energy for possibly the next year or whatever, right? So if you left a carrot in the ground, the next year you'd get a carrot growing from it. Yeah. Perennial, yes. Okay. That was your question too? Okay. All right, so those are the kind of the two different types. Now, a fibrous root, like you say, it's got, it's pretty advantageous in that it gives you a lot of area to secure yourself as well. The disadvantage of a taproot, and this is why you typically don't see large trees with taproots, is if they had a taproot, okay, and so let's say here's ground level, here's the above ground part of the tree, and then here's the taproot. If the tree gets swaying from side to side in the wind, what's going to happen down here? Yeah, it's going to pivot, right? It's going to pivot right here at ground level, and it's going to start working this root from side to side, and eventually, yeah, timber, it's going to just pull it right out. Right? So typically, big, tall trees that have to withstand winds have fibrous root systems. It gives them a much better anchor. Still, once in a while, you do see one that's been uprooted. Okay, it just gets tipped right over, and you can see the big root system just sitting there. If you've ever been in the mountains, you see that quite often, actually. Okay. But typically, taproot systems are saved for smaller plants that grow near the ground. Mesquite is actually one that has a taproot. Okay, it's a small bush. Lots of times the wood is used for smoking things because it has lots of oils and stuff in it that make meat taste good. But typically, it's got taproots. Some of those can go into the soil deep enough that they'll actually access aquifers. Like wells, people's wells. They'll get into people's wells, okay, and start pulling the water. It's not going to bother you to have a mesquite root in your well, right? It's not going to use all the water. It's just a tiny little shrub, okay. But that's what they'll do because they live in the desert as well. Okay. All right. So roots, obviously, okay, big thing. They're anchors and they absorb minerals, water, and they conduct as well. All right, stems. Stems are supportive, but they're also transportive. Okay, so they support the plant, but the bulk of their purpose is to transport material between the two places in the plant, between the leaves and the roots. Those are the leaves and the roots are really the busiest parts. That's where it's shipping and receiving kind of. Okay, and you're always going to be moving stuff in between. That's what the stem has to do. Right. So main purpose of stems: support the plant and transport nutrients from the roots to the leaves, and of course the other way around. Okay, stem's got to have lots of turgor pressure, lots of lignin, okay, because it's going to be the hardest, stiffest part of the plant. Okay, the stem is also where typically you will get new growth starting, at least. Okay, most plants grow from the ends, from the tips, but there's also going to be buds along the stem so that a plant can make new branches and new leaves. All right, now The advantage of having them here versus only on the ends of the leaf is that something often happens to plants, and that is that they get eaten. All right? And if you only have your new growth or your buds right at the end, they're always getting eaten and torn off, and then you'll die. All right? But typically they'll also have them down near where they already have branches growing. So if this branch here gets eaten, it can grow from those buds, okay, and make replacement leaves, okay, in terms of replacing what's been eaten or cut off or whatever. Right? Grass kind of does that. When you mow your lawn, it grows again. Okay, if you prune any of your trees, your shrubs or whatever, and if they grow back, that's why if you have a hedge, that's how you make your hedge look thicker and thicker. Right? If you trim it every year, you clip it, it grows from inside and it gets really thick on the outside. All right? Yeah, kind of like shaving. Yeah. Okay. You shave it, it gets thicker. Yeah, all right. So it's kind of like that with a hedge. Okay, you cut it off, and it grows from further back. Okay. All right. So does that make sense? And again, guys, this is also where the term stem cell came from, right? Because those were where those parenchyma cells we talked about the other day came from. Okay, they're mostly discovered close to the main stem cells. Okay. All right. So again, big thing. They transport and they support the plants. Vegetative propagation is what that's called. Yeah. No, not really. It's a different process because you're making a clone. Okay. These plants over here, they do that. Okay. Both of these plants actually all came from one plant many years ago. Well, they're almost as old as you. Okay. It started out, I just had one big tree like this. But when they get tall and they start to fall over, you just cut them off and stick them back in the ground. Okay. And they'll grow, and the piece you cut off will grow. You can actually see that on this one here. Right where it was cut off, there's right below it is another branch growing. Okay. And most of them are like that because that's what I've done with all of them. I just cut them off, stick them back in the pot, and they grow again. Okay, and so you get more and more and more of them. This one here, okay, this one started maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. It was only that pot before, but it was getting so full that I had to start a second pot, and it's already had several of them cut off and put back in the ground. Okay, so plants can do that, but it's called vegetative propagation. You take one piece. Bamboo does it really well. Potatoes is an example of vegetative propagation. All right, the leaves, probably the most important part, and I already told you. We talked about this diagram before. You're going to see it a whole bunch of times. Okay, it's really important that we know the layers. You're not going to need to know the C4 leaf. Okay, it's just part of this diagram. Okay, but that's like what a cacti would look like. Okay, they don't have leaves. Well, actually they do, but they're their thorns. They carry out photosynthesis from their stem, so their structure is different. But we don't need to worry about C4. Okay, we just have to worry about the C3 leaf. Okay. And that is our typical leaf structure. And again, it's just like what you looked at in the cell anatomy lab. Okay, you've got your upper epidermis, okay, right here. And that's what secretes the waxy cuticle. Those cells have few to no chloroplasts in them. Right? They need to be transparent so that light can travel through them and down to the palisade layer. Okay, you don't have to write palisade mesophyll. It can just be palisade layer. Right? The palisade layer is the part of the leaf that carries out photosynthesis. Right? So that's its main job. That's the part of the plant, the part of the leaf that makes the food. That's why all those cells are crammed together, okay? And they have such a uniform shape. It allows you to fill up that space with photosynthesizing cells. Now, underneath that is the spongy layer. Okay, so again, you don't have to know mesophyll, just spongy layer. Okay, and the spongy layer, again, it looks like a sponge. There's a whole bunch of spaces in between the cells, much different than the layer above. And in those spaces are carbon dioxide, water, oxygen, all of those things, because that layer has access to the outside. Right? Most plants only have stomates on the bottom of their leaves. Why is that smart? Well, no, if someone's eating a leaf, it's eating both parts, right? Top and bottom. If you had stomates on the top, would you lose more water? Yeah, because the sun beats down on the top of the leaf. The bottom of the leaf is always in the shade. Okay, so it makes sense to have the stomates on the bottom where it's going to be cooler and less water will be lost out of there. All right, so you always have this kind of an arrangement. You have the Palisade layer and the Spongy layer and the stomates as part of the lower epidermis. Okay, and remember that each one of the cells, okay, that make up a stomate, okay, or stoma, is called a guard cell. All right, so the cells on both sides, here and here, are the guard cells. Brian, question? Not necessarily. Mostly they flip over because it usually gets windy. Yeah, but no, I mean sometimes they'll just flip. It can increase the rate of photosynthesis if the stomates are exposed, then more water evaporates. And you sometimes see that on a humid day when it's hard to get water to go from, you know, inside the plant to a very high humidity air, right? Because that's trying to go from low to high, then it doesn't happen very well. When humidity gets to be 100%, it's pretty tough for a plant to get water to evaporate out. Okay, everybody with me there? It's just it's a genetic thing. Yeah, like a non-weeping willow grows upright. Okay, I have a weeping carigana in my front yard. Okay, and it's just a dwarf version of a regular carigana, which grows upward. It just grows downward. It's just genetic. They breed them that way. Bonsai. Yeah. They're just dwarf. Yeah. Yeah. It's like anything else, right? Like you can get dwarf pea plants if you wanted them, right? They just don't grow very tall. They grow kind of along the ground instead. It's just a genetic thing. All right, so make sure you know those layers, guys, because that often gets asked. Okay, Palisade layer, okay, Spongy layer, the stomates, the epidermis, the cuticle on the outside. Okay, all of this contributes to the plant's ability to conserve water, okay, and limit evaporation. Having those stomates on the bottom of the leaf limits the evaporation. Having the guard cells that can open and close the stomate based on their water vacuoles. Remember we talked about that the other day. Okay, that helps the plant regulate how much water is lost during photosynthesis. Okay, the waxy cuticle, all of that kind of stuff. Really know how those help a plant conserve water because it's something we always talk about. All right. So the other thing with leaves is their structure. Okay, they usually consist of a flattened blade, a stalk, and a petiole. So again, excuse my drawing ability. That's kind of a leaf. Okay, and it would have veins kind of going through it like this. Okay, this is the blade. Okay, this is the stalk. Okay, and if this was a branch here, okay, that spot where it joins up with the branch, it's usually kind of swollen and flattened. Okay, that there is the petiole. Okay, what's the purpose of having broad, flat leaves? More surface area for photosynthesis, yeah, okay, which is typically why most plants do have kind of flattened leaves, okay? Even grass, I mean, it grows long, but they're flat blades, right? They're not thick. That all helps with photosynthesis. Okay, now, to give you an idea here, plant transport-wise, first off, the xylem tubes that we talked about that transport water up, that use the polar nature of water and adhesion and cohesion and all of that, this is an electron microscope picture of what they look like. Okay, so it's 100 micro. This distance here represents 100 micrometers. All right, so you get the idea that these are pretty small, right? Maybe 10 micrometers across for a xylem tube. They need to be small because if they're too big, right, then there's too much volume inside of water, and water's heavy. Right? That polar nature of water only works for small amounts of water across small volumes. So having lots and lots of really small tubes makes a plant able to transport a lot of water. All right? Don't get the idea that inside the middle of a plant are giant straw-like tubes. All right? It simply wouldn't work. Okay? In the same way that if I give you like a really big Slurpee straw, you know, like the giant fat ones, okay? If I was able to get one that was, let's say, a meter and a half long, you probably wouldn't be able to create enough suction to get anything up that straw. All right? It would require so much force to support the volume of water that would be in that straw. Because you imagine if you had a thick straw that was this tall, you could have 100 to 150 milliliters of water in there, just in the straw. Okay? and that would be kind of heavy. Well, a plant has to rely on very small, kind of puny forces in order to draw water up the plant against a quite strong force acting in the other direction, which is gravity. That's why it needs to have small tubes. It needs its puny forces that pull up to be able to balance the strong force or overcome the strong force of gravity that's pulling down. So it needs really, really small tubes. And a big tube, cohesion and adhesion and stuff like that is simply not going to be enough to create a pulling force up. All right. So this diagram here, guys, is the numbers on it are going to be on the next page. Okay. So if you have your notes package there, it's probably, I think I put it right beside. Okay, it's numbered. So we'll just quickly go through here. Step 1 is down here in the roots, the acquisition of water through the root tissue. Right. Typically, you find, there's actually a fair amount of salty material in the roots of plants. Reason being, that helps to draw water in. Okay, it helps to draw water in by osmosis because water wants to move to the salty area, all right, and then it gets transported up the plants. All right, so you get this water coming into the plants, and then the salt balance kind of equalizes, and it begins to move up. Now, what makes it move up? We know that cohesion and adhesion and whatever support it there, but they're not what pull. What's going to create a pulling force for this plant? Yeah. The evaporation of water. Okay, this water, guys, has salts in it. All right, and when it gets to the leaves and starts to evaporate, what gets left behind? The salts. All right, so now there's a high concentration of salt left in the spongy layer of the leaves. What does water want to do with salt? It wants to balance it. What process is that? Osmosis. Okay, it's an osmotic pulling force that draws water up the plant. Okay, it is the force of water trying to go from one cell to another to balance the concentrations of salt that have been left behind. Okay, that creates the pulling force. Now, because water is a polar molecule, it's hydrogen bonded to all the other water molecules in the xylem of the plant. Okay, in those tubes. So when one water molecule moves across, it pulls on the one below it, which is attached to the one below it like the chain of monkeys, okay? And it pulls up all of them up the plant. And of course, they're also bonded by adhesion and hydrogen bonds to the inside of the xylem, all right? So they can support it there for when they're being pulled on from above, all right? So it's an osmotic pulling force, okay? You might want to write osmotic pulling force. Okay, that pulls water up a plant against gravity. Okay, and again, you got to have lots of those really small tubes for this to work, especially if you're looking at like a giant sequoia, which is, there's one actually in California that you drive through, okay, on the road. All right, they're huge. All right, if you're going to transport water in a trunk that size all the way up, 100 meters or so, you got to have a lot of leaves and a lot of pulling force. If you watered it with salt water, you would kill it, yes, okay, because then it wouldn't be able to achieve that imbalance in the leaves. There would be so much salt at the roots, it would actually start drawing it out of the rest of the plant, okay, in the same way that if we drank salt water, it would get drawn out of us. Well, those ones are specially adapted. Yeah, they actually secrete stuff around them that enables them to still do this. But yeah, it's a good question. But yeah, things that grow in the kind of the mangroves and stuff like that are specially adapted to dealing with high saline conditions, right? But around here, if you see kind of when a slough dries up, right, the stuff that grows in it is pretty orange and yellow, sick looking, right? And you can see the salt that's left behind on the surface as the water evaporates. It's very tough for plants to grow in that kind of situation. Mm-hmm. Yeah, some of it may actually be, because I mean you get kind of foam that gets, from all the organic material, and sometimes that dries on and looks white. Yeah, but a lot of it would be salt. A lot of it would be. All right, so we've got this the water evaporating up here in kind of step 4. Okay, step 3 here is just the water traveling in the xylem. Okay, the xylem tubes are the ones that transport water up the plant. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, the water evaporates from the leaves as photosynthesis occurs. Okay, so carbon dioxide's coming in, oxygen's going out, and that process makes sugar. All right, so now the leaves are making sugar. They can use the sugar they make, but down here in the roots, there's no ability to make sugar because there's no sunshine. So there's another set of tubes that will transport the sugar downwards. Those are the phloem tubes. And their structure is quite a bit different than the xylem tubes. In fact, xylem tubes are dead phloem tubes. All right, because a plant grows from the outside. All right, it always puts on a new layer on the outside every year. That's why it makes rings in a tree. Everybody follow me? If a tree grew from the inside, it would always be cracking itself, okay, pushing outward. So it always grows from the outside. All right. So the phloem is the very outside layer of the plant, and that's usually where the sap is, right? I mean, if you hit the side of a tree and you damage it a little bit, sap leaks out, right? That's because the phloem sap that contains the sugar is right on the outside, right? We actually, when I was in university, we had this great field behind our dorm where we would play football all the time. And one year, the forestry department decided they were going to plant a bunch of big mature trees that had been transplanted from somewhere right in the middle of our perfect football field. So we decided that we didn't like that, so we went out and we rang them all. Okay, and then the forestry department came in, and it was in the newspaper and everything. They grafted across the rings that we had made this newspaper paper mache stuff. It was like a skin graft, but for a tree, and it worked, and the trees lived. We were so disappointed because we figured we were so smart. We cut the phloem all the way around the outside so that they couldn't transport sugar to the roots, and the trees would die. Because we had a guy who was in forestry in our dorm, okay? And he told us how to do that. Well, what's that? He graduated, yeah. Okay. Well, we called his nickname was Tree Mugger. Tree Mugger. Okay. But yeah, so if you ring a tree, then it can transport water, or the sugar down. It transports water up just fine, but no sugar gets to the roots, and eventually the roots starve, okay, and the tree dies, unless forestry students make paper mache skin grafts for their trees. Okay. And you could actually see, even for a couple of years after that, you could see the newspaper, like you could see like the comic strips and stuff that were. And the tree eventually just grew right over it. Okay, like it grew all new kind of chunky material over top. It was weird. And unfortunate, because it's hard to play football when you're running into a tree all the time. All right, so you got sugary sap coming down through the phloem and then coming into the roots. Okay, and the roots burn that sugar. They use oxygen, they burn the sugar, and they release carbon dioxide. So that's what's going on there. That's cellular respiration, okay? The process of converting sugar into energy. Okay? What organelle does that go on in? It's converting sugar into energy. What organelle is that going on in? Okay, so there you go. See? Always a way to go back. All right, so that's what we just talked about. Okay, number 1 was roots absorbing water. Number 2, roots exchanging gases. Okay, cellular respiration. Number 3 was water being transported upward as xylem sap. Xylem sap is very thin because it's mostly water. Okay, transpiration occurs, so evaporation of water creates a force, creates that, what we said, osmotic pulling force that pulls the sap upwards. Okay, leaves exchange gases. Okay, sugar is produced, and sugar is transported within the phloem. Okay, in phloem sap, and phloem sap is thicker. In fact, that's what maple syrup is. All right, if you've ever had maple syrup, you are drinking the phloem sap, or eating, probably don't drink it, okay, the phloem sap of a maple tree. Okay, if you've ever seen how they do that, they actually insert a tap right into the side of the maple tree. Now that tap does not go in very far. Okay, it basically just goes far enough in to get to the phloem, and then it slowly drips out. Don't get the idea they open that tap and it rushes out. Okay, it's not like that at all. It's a very slow drip, drip, drip kind of process. No, it goes to a central collecting area. Yeah, yeah. Because if they leave the buckets out, bugs get in it. Yeah. Question? Or I would just say, tell me, how water and sugar are transported, and you would have to say, well, in the xylem this happens, and there's this evaporation and osmotic pulling force, and then what transports the phloem sap down? Gravity, yeah. The plant doesn't have to do anything special for that. Gravity will take care of it. Okay. All right. So inside of the stem of a plant, in this case we're looking at the trunk of a tree because it's bigger. Okay. The xylem is in the middle. Okay, it's the interior part of the plant because they're dead phloem tubes. Okay, and we said the plant grows from the outside. Okay, it adds on a layer each year, making those tree rings. So the phloem is the outer portion of the tree, okay, or stem of any plant, and that's where all the sugary sap will be. And all of the small tubes, okay, are inside, and they're transporting water up the plant. Okay. So you can see here in the xylem, and this is how you can tell that xylem tubes are actually old phloem tubes. We were talking about this the other day, that phloem tubes have these plates in them. And they have those plates to keep big chunks of, or crystals of sugar from forming and then clogging the tubes. So when a sugar crystal hits one of these tubes, the weight of the sap from above breaks it up. And then the small parts will go through the holes and the sap will continue to flow. If that ever gets jammed up, then that phloem tube stops transporting sugar down. Okay. Well, or just the surrounding ones. Again, these aren't very big, right? Because they become the xylem tubes. They're microscopic, right? They're very, very thin, right? But as they die, those screens essentially get broken up. Okay, they become a little wider, and the thinner sap flows through them very, very easily. Right? And again, you've got that bonding of the water to the sides. Okay, so phloem and xylem, really important terms. Okay. All right, so in the xylem, okay, this is what we've got going on, kind of obviously greatly enlarged. You've got your water molecules, okay, right here. Okay, you've got cohesion, hydrogen bonding between the two water molecules. Okay, so the one hydrogen bonds to the oxygen of another, okay, and they hold on to each other. Adhesion is hydrogen bonding between the water molecule and the inside of the xylem. Okay, and that creates this ability, or this chain of monkeys effect, right, that pulls all the water up as one or two molecules evaporate, okay, in the leaves. And when they evaporate, any moisture, any salts that were in the solution are left behind. That creates that osmotic pressure that we talked about yesterday in the reverse osmosis thing. Okay, osmotic pressure that pulls water back up the plant. Okay, all right, so big thing to remember there is water evaporates from the leaves, okay, becomes more concentrated, and that pulls the water up. Okay, that's that osmotic pulling force. Okay, everybody good with that? All right. And then the phloem, okay, phloem transports the sugar, okay, so transports sugar that are made in the leaves, okay, down to the roots, and that's accomplished obviously by gravity. Okay, nothing special about how that gets pulled down. Okay, but it is quite viscous, right? And as winter approaches, that stuff thickens and doesn't quite harden, but gets really, really thick. Okay, kind of sugary looking. You obviously don't want it to completely freeze, because if it does, it could rupture, okay, the tubes. So it does, because of all that sugar in it, it typically doesn't freeze, right? Keeps it from freezing. The xylem sap, though, it doesn't have any sugar in it. So how do we keep that part from freezing? Well, no, because in the winter you've lost all your leaves, right? Is there any reason to transport water to the top of the plant now? No, in the wintertime the xylem tubes are dry. Okay? There haven't been any leaves on the tree for a while. There hasn't been anything pulling water up, so the water just falls down back to the roots and kind of back out into the soil, and the tree dries up in the winter. Okay? Or dries out in the middle of the winter, and then you don't have to worry about any of that kind of freezing and rupturing from the inside. You know, if you've ever seen what happens sometimes with a tree in a flash freeze, is it will crack. It'll crack the tree. Or if a tree gets struck by lightning, anyone ever seen that? Okay, the tree explodes. Okay, because it boils the sap inside, like flash boils it, and it expands rapidly and just explodes out of the tree. Okay, and there's splinters and everything goes everywhere. It's quite freaky if you actually see it happen close. Okay, also because lightning is scary close. Okay, but trees exploding is also kind of cool, as long as you're not real close. Okay. All right. So again, the phloem tubes are really small. Okay, there's a small amount of diffusion and osmosis that allows sugar to get out at various places and stuff like that. Okay. All right, I'd like you to answer those questions here in the remaining few minutes that we have in class, and then we'll talk about them tomorrow before we start the Transport in Plants lab.